Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here, back with the second half of our After Effects Cinema 4D logo extrusion animation extravaganza. And it's about a week after the Super Bowl, and my logo design pick, the Seahawks, did end up winning. So I figured I should probably get off my butt and add some animation to this thing as promised. So this is our clip that is the final result, which we'll be working towards. And I've been thinking about some of this stuff for a little while here and what I wanted to accomplish here, because I didn't just want to add animation and a couple of rotation and camera keyframes. I wanted to go beyond that. I made my little list here of points that I wanted to cover, and we'll take a look at that. I've been thinking about this, and I wanted a couple of things. I wanted this flare in the back to actually be blocked out like it would in real life when the head of this passes through it, which I figured would be a good challenge. And I wanted to figure out how to best integrate all of the new Cineware Cinema 4D After Effects integration stuff to accomplish this and make the workflow easier, so I didn't have to fake it and add a bunch of animating masks and a bunch of keyframes moving around later in After Effects. I wanted to do as much as I could to actually block this stuff out. So I started with the things that I knew. I know optical flares, if you're using that, can link to lights if we look over here. And I know if we look at our Cineware layer, it can extract scene data like lights in our cameras. And I knew there's this multipath option where we could extract passes such as depth passes, which I was somewhat familiar with before doing this. And I did a similar animation a couple months ago for CBS Sports where there's a 3D object and there's flares tracking. And I did this one using Video Copilot's Element 3D, and it worked great. And for this one, I wanted to make it a little more challenging. I wanted to show off some of the Cinema 4D stuff, and I wanted those real shadows and reflections like you would get with 3D programs. And this one, there's lights tracking, but I didn't have anything in the back, and I wanted to figure out how to address this issue of if we have a little flare on the tail that would be blocked by an object. Figured out there was a lot of little steps that I added up to do this. So I put together this little list, and I'll put this in the description, and these are all the little things that I wanted to cover that I figured out would get us to here without having to have a bunch of keyframes and masks. So that's enough of me talking. Let's get right to it. So this is where we left off in the first part of the tutorial. In After Effects, we set up our Cinema 4D file, we extruded the logo, we brought it into After Effects, and we added some flares. And this works great for a still. We cranked all the settings up, but the issue is, once we actually want to animate all of this stuff, if we add stuff in Cinema 4D, these lights aren't going to react, and it's going to kind of break. So we have to figure out how to connect all of this stuff. So we're going to hop into Cinema 4D, and I'm going to use Cinema 4D Lite in After Effects. I have the full studio version that I like to work in, but just to point out how well these things are connected, I'm in After Effects, and to reopen this, I'm going to go to Edit, Edit Original down here, or I can press Command E, and we want to add some animation. So what we're going to do is have this logo rotate from this side to the other side over 3 seconds. And there's a couple ways we could add animation in Cinema 4D. We can check off the parameters we want to animate down here and add a keyframe, or we can go to coordinates, say we just want to rotate this way. Rather than checking all of them, we can just Command click that rotation. Maybe I'll set it back a little, and remember to Command click if you make a change and update it. It doesn't work the same as After Effects. You have to remember to update that anytime you make a change. Command click, and 90 seconds, 90 frames later, I want it to go over here, and that'll be our end frame. So Command click again, new keyframe, good. And now that I'm looking at this thing, if this is going to be a big part of it, this thing is a little too wide. So I'm going to want to just scale this whole thing down. I could go in and change all the extrudes, but I'm just going to press T, and I'll put it at a center frame so I can see where this would be, and just scale that whole thing down a bit. So if we're looking at this here, we do a quick render, we still get a lot of the detail, and that's fine. And as we're adding animation, I want to point out one thing about, we can see that it's taking a while to render, and we don't want to deal with that either when we get into After Effects. And we're just working on this now. We don't need to see all these details every single time. So it's a good habit to get into of, in our render settings, know that we're going to crank up the anti-aliasing and turn on ambient occlusion, and in our lights have all of these different types of shadows. But for now, I'm just going to turn all that stuff off so I can work quicker. So I'm going to turn off the AO and anti-aliasing for our standard render for Cinema 4D light. I'm just going to turn it on to none. And my fill light, I have an area shadow, which takes a while to render. And my key light, I have a soft, which takes less time, but it's still some time. So I'm just going to select both of those and turn off both of those shadows. So now if I do a quick Command R, instant almost. And it doesn't look that good, but that's fine. We can still see what's going on while we're doing our animation. So I have my logo here. If I do play, we can see our first little move, and that's good. And what I like about our lighting that we set up is we have different color lights on the side, so when it spins around, we get that nice darker light. And that'll help later too when we're compositing in those flares to make it look like everything is connected and really working. So the next thing we want to do is add that keyframe animation to the camera for our move. So what we're going to do for that is use the different property of animation and just check some of these off. So I'm going to grab my camera, and this is going to be my end position at, let's say, 60. It gets to here. Let's say maybe 75, and we can always tweak this later. And I'm just moving the position and the rotation. So I'm going to turn those off, make a keyframe, go back to my beginning, or press Shift F for beginning. And I'm just going to dolly this camera back a bit and make sure I don't go through the floor. So it looks like I went a little too far. You can always move this up a bit and just scale, not scale, but just pull that camera back, add a new keyframe. And then if I play, all right, good. So now we got our logos rotating around. It looks nice. You can see our lights are hitting a bit. And we got our camera move. And that's really all the animation we need to add in Cinema 4D to get what we're doing. So now the next thing we want to do is set up what our lights are going to be when we reference that later in After Effects and Optical Flares. And as I mentioned, over in After Effects, when we're on this, we can extract scene data, and that'll bring in lights and cameras, and we can bring in these lights, but I actually don't want those lights to be the lights that are here. I want to just set up something as a reference that I can later add a light to. And that's a long explanation of me just talking about it, so let me just show you what we're going to do. We're going to create nulls just like we would in After Effects on the points that we want the lights. So I had this one on the tail, so I'm going to create object null, and I'm just going to get out of my camera view, and I'm going to move that into place exactly where I want it on the back of that tail. And maybe it'll be easier to do on a frame like this where the logo's actually lining up correctly. So I'll just move this, my front view, just get that one exactly on the left side, or camera left of that tail, line it up, and I'll call that null, not my camera, and I'll call that null A. And I'll just move this down. And now I want another one on the front and the little nose of this. So I'm just going to copy paste that null, and I'll rename that null B just for my own reference. And I'm going to move that one down to our front of the logo, headed down by the beak a bit, and get that on this side. So they're kind of on different sides of the logo, which will look nice later. And let me just pop back in here and make sure those are exactly where I wanted it. And let me check A, and we can always reposition these later, and that's kind of the great thing about this workflow is we can do all this stuff, and if we do all of our steps and get to the end and we're like, you know what, I want this slightly different, it's really easy to go back into Cinema 4D, update this, and have After Effects read it pretty easily. So I got my two nulls on the back and the front, and I want those to be moving with the logo. So rather than animate those, I'm just going to drag them into this logo group null. And now if I grab one and I press play, Yes, this is good. This is dragging along with that, and I don't have to animate those at all if I don't want to. But if we look at the video, I did have a little extra going on. Once this camera moves around, the second light actually drops down right on the edge a little, and that's nice. It's as if this extra little flare is, moving with that, which is totally not realistic how light would bounce into a camera, but neither is a giant Seahawks logo on a green floor. So let's do that. So within this null, I want to animate this down a bit. So same thing we did with our camera. I'm going to grab this. I'm going to turn off rotation. And let's say right when the camera gets around there, so let's say at frame 50, this thing starts to drop down. So I'm going to make just a frame on position. I'll go to frame about 80. And let me get in my side view, and it'll be a little easier to get this correct. I'm just going to drag this down and get it almost at the bottom. And then I'm going to add another keyframe. So now we can see it's made a line and connected those two keyframes. But it's a straight line, and I want it to really be exactly following that as much as possible. So I can click on my keyframe, and in the keyframe properties, I'm going to turn off auto tangent on both of them. And that's going to let me get my curves like I would on the spline to drag this around. And one quick little tip is these arrows are kind of in the way. If you press Option D or Alt D on a PC, it'll hide your controls. And I can grab this, and if I want to just edit part of or one side, I can hold Shift and just get this exactly how I want it to. So now if we back this up, you can see if I Option D to turn that back on, our null is animating along that, and that's nice. If we go to our outside view and play this little section, you can see it's not a light yet, but that little object is really animating there. And the last thing I want to do is it kind of hits that hard. And if you're familiar with easing in keyframes in After Effects, we can do something similar. If you see what I'm talking about, just kind of like bang, runs into that. So what I'm going to do to get the same sort of thing is just change this left time, right time value of this keyframe. So click that one. And I'm going to make the left time -15 and just zero out right time. And what that's going to do is ease that in a little better. So you can see it slows down. And now that we're looking at this, maybe I want this whole thing to start animating a little earlier, so the whole process is a little slower. So I'll just click, drag, move this keyframe to like 25. Let's just watch this whole thing. All right, going, going, going. Oh, I can see that this keyframe is a little off here. So I can just fix that, hop out of my camera view, and just make sure that that's not going off of there, because it will bother me later. And it's fine if it goes a little in. I don't have a problem with that. And when I make a change to this, let's see if this happens. It might reset my curves, and I might have to readjust those. So just a little thing to fix, but things that might come up while you're doing this. So good to see how to deal with that and remember that that might happen. So fix that, adjust that, go back into my main view. It zeroed out, or change those again. So let's do again -15, 0, and let's play this whole thing and see if that's going well. All right, I am good with that. The only thing we need to do on these, as I mentioned in After Effects, when you click extract, it'll bring cameras and lights. It's not by default going to bring in null. So what we need to do is right click on either null and go to Cinema 4D tags, external compositing. And you could make this a solid, or we could just make it a null, which it'll do by default. And what that's going to do is make that show up when we click extract. So to get that first one over to the second one, we could just hold Command, drag, and drop it there to make a duplicate of that tag. Now, that's everything we need to do for the animation. The other thing that we need to set up in Cinema 4D is to get that depth where that front of the head is actually blocking out that light when we get into After Effects. And how we're going to do that, as I said, is with a depth path that we're going to then use as black and white information for a track matte. And the way you find that is in render settings, under multipass, check that, and right click and go to depth. And it's not going to do anything by default when we render this out or bring it into After Effects, because we need to set up one more thing. The way that it's figuring out that depth is in our camera. If we look at our top view, there's under object this focus distance. And even though we're not using focus depth in this, it still matters when we're rendering out this depth pass. We can change this, and we can even set a focus object, and to get it exact on that null, because that's what we want to block out in front of, we can click and drag that focus object into that focus object null A, and it'll snap it right there. And if we play, it's going to move that around with this logo, and that's great. So that's the last thing in Cinema 4D, so not too difficult. Got everything working pretty easily. So I'm going to save this, go back over into After Effects, and now let's get to extracting all of this information. So I can turn my settings down because I don't need to see all of this detail. And I'm going to turn off these flares for now because we'll get back to that. So the first thing I'm going to do is extract my scene data. And what that's going to do is bring in my camera and my lights and those nulls I set up as it was in Cinema 4D. And that's awesome. That's such a time saver and one of the best parts of this. So I don't need these lights because those are what are lighting the object, and I don't need those in After Effects. So I'm just going to delete those. And if we grab one of these nulls and scrub through, we can see that it's actually copied over all of the position and movement information from Cinema 4D just based on it being in this logo null. So that is, again, awesome because that's going to get us exactly what we want. And we have our camera that's been brought over with the same information as the camera in Cinema 4D, so everything's going to be replicated and lined up. So that's to get our nulls. Let's set up these flares first, and then we'll deal with blocking out that back one. So I have my null A, which is our back one. Let's just start there. So I turn on my flares layer, and if I turn on all my lights, and it's not going to look like anything is happening because now they're somewhere out way in space based on this camera that we brought in. So we need to bring those back into our scene and get it exactly here. So these are my three lights. I know that this one was the front one, so I'll just rename these quickly. Front light, tail light, and this was just that bottom one at the bottom just to add some extra glow. So we'll just call this front glow for now. So I'm going to grab my tail light and shift parent it to null A, and what that's going to do is parent it and move it there, or do that in the opposite order, but it's going to get it there. So then if we play this, you can see that it's moving with that tail, and that's awesome. Again, we didn't have to do any tracking, it's all just connecting. And the other thing is that problem that we're getting, that was my goal of making this challenging, is when this passes behind the head, have that light blocked out, and I don't just want to fake it in, keyframe that opacity on and off. And that was what we did with that depth pass. Over on our Cineware layer, click Cinema 4D multipass, then define multipass, and click add image layers. What that's going to do is bring in a black and white depth layer with the focus distance set to that point. And that's great because we can use that as a track matte for this flares layer. So down here, I'll go to Luma, inverted, and turn back on my Cineware layer, 0 to random preview, or just scrub through. We can see that it will block this out. And you can still see a little bit of it. Shift Option H to get rid of my extras so I can see this. And the great thing about this is we're in After Effects, so we can adjust this by adding a hue, saturate, or brightness, contrast, hide. I already typed it in over here, to this depth layer, and we can bring up the brightness and contrast. And if we turn this off, we can see what's happening to really blow out that contrast. So keep turning it up, you can see that thing is completely gone now. So now if we press 0 to play this, and this is great because it's caching that Cinema 4D, so I didn't even cut in editing, just press 0 again, and it's automatically doing that pretty quickly, no render time. We get to these frames, we can see that it is actually blocking that out. How awesome is that? So challenge met that we set up for ourselves. So we got this working now. If we ran preview, the flare is sticking to that tail and being blocked out. And this is by far the most complex part of this process in my mind. And the nice thing about this track matte process based on the depth pass is this doesn't have to be optical flares if you didn't want it to be, or if you don't have it, or if you just wanted to put like a little ball of light with a solid there, or if you wanted to composite a little guy sitting there but then you don't see him. That's kind of the power of this, of what this has done. It could really be anything that's tracked there and being blocked out by the front of the head. I'm just using optical flares as an example of putting all this stuff together. So we want to do the same thing for the second light. We have our front light down here, and we want to turn that on and shift parent it to null B, but we don't want it blocked out by this front, because that's not what's happening, and that's not, it is visible. So what we're actually going to do is shut that off for a second, and if we look in optical flares, we can change from lights and track lights on to name starts with, and just change it to a letter. So I put it at A. It's going to look for lights that start with the letter A, and none start with there, so I can rename my tail light to A tail light, and boom, it's back there. Now if I ram preview again, it's all working, and if I turn on this front light, hopefully, yep, as planned, nothing happens because this one's not named that. So what we can do is just duplicate this flares layer. I'll drag it above the lights just for organization. And with that duplicate of the flares layer, turn off my track matte because I don't need it anymore because it's in the front and I don't want to track matting this null. And put the front light there. And remember to shift parent it to null B. And then with this flares layer, I'm going to do name starts with B, turn this light on, and then call it B front light. So now if we play, we're pretty much there, and that's following the null that we set up in Cinema 4D. So quick RAM preview, and we can see that back one is getting blocked out as we wanted. This front one is traveling as we wanted, and we're pretty much there. The only extra thing I added was I copied that whole thing again, just do another copy of flares, drag it up here, put on light starts with C, and for that front glow, which is a nice little extra touch that's in the final, just call that C front glow. This one was just kind of floating in our scene, so I'll just put it off camera, kind of down here. And then if we play this, that's pretty much it. And that just gives us some nice little extra, you don't need it, but I just wanted a little extra going on. So now that's pretty much it. We can drag our original vignette and color correction on top of everything if we want. Ooh, that looks ugly, so I'll just leave it down there. Looks like I don't want that on my flares. And now I'll just save, and then back in Cinema, I can go back in here, and now we can crank back up all those settings as you want. So we'll turn back on the ambient occlusion. For my key light, I'll put it back on area. Fill light, put it back on soft. And in the standard render for Cinema 4D light, what we're going to want to do is turn on our anti-aliasing higher, basically as long as you have the render time. So I'll put it on best, and I'll do 1x1 and max level 4x4. You could crank this way up, and it's going to make the render times higher. It might not be worth it, but it just depends how long of a render you want. So then I'll save this, and then in After Effects, it's going to update, and pretty much all we would have left to do is render this out and get to our final video here. But rather than just saying you're supposed to render out, point out a couple of things about rendering this stuff out. You can see how quickly that even updated there. How nice is that? So when we're rendering out our final video in After Effects Creative Cloud, there's the old way to do it, composition, add to render queue, and there's also this add to Adobe Media Encoder queue. So that launches Adobe Media Encoder, and now we can render it out here, figure out where I'm going to save my file. I'll go into my little tutorial folder, and click our render settings here, and it's going to open up this connection. And now I can change those render settings to what I want to, put it back at the right frame rate. And this gives us a bit more control over all of these settings and allows us to render this out externally from After Effects rather than holding up After Effects completely while we're rendering. And that's pretty much it. I just hit OK and then play, and it's going to render that out, and we're going to end up with this nice video that we had with all of our stuff happening, all of our animation going, our flare moving, all of our cool new knowledge about depth passes, and yeah, that's pretty much it. That got us there. So I hope you learned a lot with this one. It was a fun one for me to put together. It was some good challenges. It really shows off a lot that you can do with Cinema 4D, integration, After Effects, and all of these cool things you can do with the Cineware layer like multipasses and extracting this and really working the connection that's being made between these two. So I hope you learned a lot, and I'll see you at the next video.